Oh man, I just saw the French Dispatch and God, Wes, you did it again. On top of this, having the regular Wes Anderson crew, Bill Murray, Tilda Swinton, Adrian Brody, Frances McDormand, Owen Wilson, Saoirse Ronan, Jason Schwartzman, Willem Dafoe, and Ed Norton, Bob Balaban, and Angelica Houston, Timothy Chalamet, but also Liev Schreiber and Jeffrey Wright pop up randomly at one point, and that's just awesome. And then you've also got Leah Seydoux coming off of No Time to Die, which they could have done Bond better. Whatever. And then, of course, Benicio del Toro. So it's an all-star cast, and when you look into the research that Wes did for the movie and how they had to find a seemingly perfect place in France for the movie, you can see the genuine love and appreciation he has for the source material, seeing as how this movie and its format of several short stories is based on The New Yorker. And combined with that, it also just gives something new you can notice with every rewatch, and that is definitely something I plan to do. But seeing as how I'm broke at the moment, I will have to wait until this is on Google Play before I can buy it. But this is just another example of just everything Wes Anderson does great, that honestly I don't know how much it's made at the box office, but I can guarantee it's not enough. And more people should definitely make time to go see this, because they will walk out of the theater having enjoyed the past 2 hours, I believe. I believe it's 2 hours. I didn't check my clock. It makes me angry that I had to wait a full 2 weeks after its initial release. It only came out in 52 theaters a couple weeks ago, and none of the theaters here in Lubbock were playing it, and it was definitely worth the wait. Now, I don't know who I would vote for to win Best Director between Wes Anderson and Denis Villeneuve for Dune and the French Dispatch. Honestly, it's a tie for me at this point. You know what comes with a Wes Anderson movie? You got, side note, Tony Revolori have come back from, of course, the Grand Budapest Hotel. The deadpan comedy in this was very funny. On top of that, of course, you're going to get the symmetry, the saturated colors, and on top of that, just like the blank-faced deadpan comedy that's done right in his movies. There are things, if you don't pay attention, you're going to miss. I think he's added something else to his signature, because instead of just having a traditional freeze frame, when you look closely, you realize all the actors standing in place, they're standing still with whatever they're holding, whatever action they're doing, and that's just great. And you can see them shaking a little bit. Also, the animation, I know he's done 2 great stop motion animation movies, but some animation sequences in this movie, not the most advanced, but they just look really cool. And especially with how he blends the black and white and the color in this movie at certain points of the story. It's got 3 separate stories, one of a student revolution and writing a manifesto as a challenge to the authority and wanting some change. That's the portion that Timothée Chalamet's in with Frances McDormand. And the last part is a story concerning Jeffrey Wright as Roebuck Wright, who has a typographic memory instead of a photographic memory, something he makes abundantly clear when Liev Schreiber asks him about it, and he's able to recite the story he wrote about a kidnapping, which is the first point you see Edward Norton in the movie. They almost poison the people who capture him, but through they initially just ask the cook to poison them, but they have the cook try the food before they eat it, and it ends up killing everybody because the poison's in the radishes. Kidnapped boy's dad knows he doesn't like radishes. Thing is, the leader of the kidnappers, Edward Norton, also doesn't like radishes, so he isn't killed either. And then the chase scene to catch him is all animated, and like I said, it's not the most advanced animation, but it just looks cool. It looks great. There's some comedy in that too. For instance, so what happens is they're driving around. Edward Norton breaks through a door in his car. He drives around. They're shooting at him, but he keeps going around the same. It's like a town square. He keeps going around in the same circle. Meanwhile, the wrestler that they asked to come gets on Edward Norton's car, holds on. Meanwhile, behind him, Jeffrey Wright and the kid's dad are driving, driving after him, and then he stops. The wrestler is flung through a boarded up window, and then he gets out. And then so does Jeffrey Wright, and kid's dad are running after him. And they go through all these obstacles, all these stairs, ladders, sewers, and everything, just to end up going in a huge circle. They all get back in their cars, and all for the kid to just use the coin he has that he used to kind of orchestrate his own escape, where he asked Owen Wilson's character, who was a journalist, who's like a traveling journalist. He's only in the movie for I'm going to say combined 5 to 8 minutes. He's able to read the Morse code, and that starts off the whole chef escape plot. And all the kid ends up doing is using a coin to cut his own rope, get out of the sunroof, jump into his dad's arms. They're flung through the windshield of the car that the dad is chasing Edward Norton in. They embrace because they're father and son. But the kid gets a quick punch in because he's pissed off at his dad. In the first story, they have Tilda Swinton giving a presentation about this artist's life while introducing the French Dispatch, based in Kansas, which is where we first meet Bill Murray, who, although Bill Murray isn't in the film a lot, he does have a big impact throughout the whole film because he is the leader of the newspaper that's the namesake of the movie. And he has several moments to shine. One is when he fires an intern and he starts to kind of cry. And really? He says, "Hey, don't cry. There's no crying in my office." He says, "Really?" And then the camera just pans up and you see a no crying label right over the door. Moments like that. There's also another nice moment where Roebuck is locked up for being gay. And when Bill Murray asks him, "What are you in for?" he says, "Love, just the wrong kind." And he offers him a job, but he says, "Read this book. I want 300 words. Read this. I want 300 words by tomorrow. I'll advance you 500 francs. Of course, I'll take 250 out for your bail, but I'll re-advance that if I like what I read." And then a guard comes over to let him out. He says, "Not right now. I'm conducting a job interview." And there's also a nice epilogue where he dies, and then all the journalists are in his office, and they all start to write his obituary. And meanwhile, there's cake. Someone brings in a cake, and he starts to light the candles. Then they say, "Don't light the candles. Can't you see we're mourning his death?" And then one by one, everyone says, "Oh, I'll take a piece." "Yeah, me too. And then meanwhile, while they're talking about him, they're talking about what to do, he's handing out the cake to individual people. And like I said, in the last shot, they start to write his obituary. And it's, kind of just a brief summary, and that's when the movie ends. And I just can't wait to see this movie again. A second, third, fourth, just like with Grand Budapest Hotel and Fantastic Mr. Fox. I can just watch those movies over and over and over and never get tired of them. Man. There's also an interaction where Bill Murray is talking to Tilda Swinton, who's used her company card or charged her expense to the company for her trip to go see Benicio del Toro's art exhibit, which she eventually, in the end, does get the wall to be put in the middle of Kansas because she loves the artwork. And when she gets back to the office in Kansas, Bill Murray's reading off her expenses, and he says, "My God, you went all the way to Ennui, France to see a prisoner's artwork that wasn't even on a canvas." And she says, "Yes." He says, "And all on my dime?" And she says, "Of course." So it's stuff like that just adds little fun moments to the movie. Is asked about this artist as well. Tilda Swinton explains this artist's life, and that's where you see Leah Seydoux and Benicio del Toro, who's the artist, and he's maximum security cell in prison for killing two men for homicide, but he's actually a really talented artist, but he's also very dark and troubled, which they point out in a really cool scene where they say, we asked him to just scribble something and he drew this to show he's really artistically gifted. They show that he just drew a perfect sparrow. But then he said when we asked him to draw a real sparrow looking out his window, he drew this, and it's like something we can't really see anything in it. It's like, I guess what they call abstract. And he says, well, this would only happen with a dark and tortured soul, wouldn't it? This whole plot involves, of course, Leah Seydoux, who is his model and his muse. She's nude, but then he touches her with some paint. But then when he tries to touch her again, she slaps the paintbrush out of his hand. And then she goes behind the changing room, and it turns out she's a prison guard. In editing, I realized that the recap was sloppy, so I needed a better one. This is the part where Tilda Swinton in the present day takes a moment to cut away and talk about the upbringing of this guard that Leah Seydoux plays. Talks about how she grew up on a farm and how now that she's a guard, she has a thing for sleeping with inmates, and she talks about how it might be just like the captivity that intrigues her, but she doesn't actually love them. And she talks about how her childhood kind of influenced her to like never actually try to fall in love. And this is also right after this when we're introduced to Adrien Brody, who's in prison for what I guess is referred to white collar crime. And you see that he's able to kind of do whatever the hell he wants because he can just bribe the officers. That's initially how he gains access to Benicio del Toro. He's able to inquire about his artwork, and initially Benicio says 60 cigarettes. He says, I'll do better than that. I can give you 250,000 real francs. But first he gives him whatever he has in his pocket, which is just like some change and a couple cigarettes. And he says, I'll wire whatever the remaining balance is to your account. Don't worry, I'm good for it. And after he gets out, this is when he talks to his uncles, and he shows him his painting of Leah Seydoux nude. But he says, don't you see the naked woman? And then his uncles say, no, I can't. No. He says, can you see it? He says, no, I can't really see anything. He says, well, she's there. And he's the next big artist. And I've already given him an advance for a show. And so we need to build up. And so they start to build up all this hype for him by making posters and everything, spreading the word. And all the while, Benicio del Toro, there's an exchange between Benicio del Toro and Leah Seydoux right after they have sex, where he tells her, or at least tries to tell her, that he loves her, while at the same time she says, I don't love you. And he says, well, that was only part of what I was going to say. You interrupted me. And she says, okay, well, what else were you going to say? And several times he tries to say, will you marry me? But every time she consistently interrupts him and says no. At this point, you see that he's kind of heartbroken, and he straps himself into the electric chair, saying that he'd rather be killed and tortured. And she briefly turns the switch on. It shocks him. She walks up to him. Meanwhile, the camera's focused on her. She gives him a brief summary about her life, with the subtitles, of course. And then she says, you will finish, because I know you can, and I know you're great. And she walks back to the switch. She says, now, do you really want me to turn the switch back on? And at this point, it goes back to him, and he frantically tries to unstrap himself from the electric chair. Turns out he takes his damn time to finish this thing. Adrien Brody gets pissed off because him and his uncles have built up all this hype for him for his exhibition, and he finally does it. And it turns out to be a great success, but there's a twist. So as a final FU to Adrien Brody and his uncles in the movie, Benicio del Toro did make the art that they all wanted to see, but he didn't use a canvas. Instead, he used the wall as his canvas. And that pisses him off. There's this thing where Benicio del Toro growls, and Adrien Brody insults him. And he starts growling. He says, don't growl at me. And he throws a tray at him. And then, in the meantime, he tells him, get out of that, because he's sitting in a wheelchair this whole time. He says, get out of that wheelchair so I can kick your ass like a real man. And immediately after that, there's, if you've seen a Wes Anderson movie, you know the shot where the camera's behind the person in the car or on the motorcycle. but he's in his wheelchair chasing Adrian Brody around the room while Adrian Brody's running around throwing food and other trays at him because he's actually scared. Because as we see in a flashback to his parole hearing, the reason he's in a maximum security level of prison is because he decapitated 2 butchers in a bar with a bone saw. And when he's asked about this, he says it was an accident. And when Adrian Brody tries to give a defense, he says, well, the first one was an accident. The second one, it was in self-defense. And when we go back to the present, a guard comes in and says, there's been an uprising. There's a ton of angry, pissed off prisoners out the door. Adrian Brody takes a peek, sees everyone with a weapon in their hand, and he comes back in and asks, what do I do? And the guard says, lock the door. As soon as he does that, they all just crash through the door, and there's a big fight, and we get one of the freeze frames that I talked about where it's not actually a freeze frame. They're all just, and you even see him shaking a little bit. The second story is led by Timothy Chalamet's Zeffirelli, who leads a student rebellion. And it begins when him and the boys are fighting for access to the girls' locker room, and they're playing a chess game for it while Frances McDormand is covering it as an American journalist. And later on, she's invited to Zeffirelli's house by his parents, and turns out that they also invited her ex. And when they say that, they say they knew that if they had told her he was coming, she wouldn't have accepted. And she says, "You're right." And then she goes to the bathroom when because they think she's crying, but it's just, she tells them there's something in the air, and it's actually tear gas because you hear the police using it outside. And so she goes to the bathroom. Meanwhile, Zeffirelli's in the tub, and then she pulls back the curtain. She says, "I'm naked." She says, "I can see that." He says, "Please don't stare. I'm nervous about my new muscles." And she says, "What are you writing about?" He says, "Well, I'm writing my manifesto." He says, do you want to look at it?" She says, "Sure." And then he hands it to her straight out of the tub, goes back in, and he says, "It's very moist." He says, "Physically or the content?" She says, "Both." He says, "Don't criticize my manifesto." He says, "Oh, you don't want an honest critique?" And so she pulls out her red pen, and they both leave. And at this point, then in the next frame, you hear the bed springs squeaking, and then turns out that they had sex. And this is the third time where the male's fallen in love with an older female. It happens in Isle of Dogs. It happens in Moonrise Kingdom. It happens in the Grand Budapest Hotel, even though and it happens in Rushmore. And even though in the Grand Budapest Hotel, Ralph Fiennes is like an adult and the woman who dies is like really old, but still, it's seen in 4 of his movies, now 5 with French Dispatch. And I gotta say, it's getting weird. It's a little weird at this point. I don't know what's up with that. But after that, he lets her finish the manifesto, and she adds an appendix, and then he gives a flashback as to how the rebellion, who involves all the students, got started. And it turns out that, and this is when he talks about, in the flashback, to talk about the beginning of the student rebellion. He talks about how it was a different time. It was a different time. And then he says it was almost 6 months ago. And what makes it funny is he talks about it as it was decades ago, when he talks about their hair and their clothes and the style and how they were talking. And it starts when one of the people who went off to war, he comes back and burns his military badge and says, "I can't wear this in confidence anymore." And over the months, you see the rebellion growing and developing, and you get to the present where the students are playing a chess game with the mayor and the government to see if they get their way. And every time they make a move, it's broadcast from the students to the cops there ready to charge to the mayor, and vice versa every time the mayor and the government make a move. But what happens after one turn, the girl who likes Zeffirelli and who constantly has like a makeup mirror, she criticizes his manifesto and specifically the appendix, and it seems like that's the consensus worst part. Even Zeffirelli says this is probably the part that they're gonna hate. This part will probably get the most hate, and he's right. And after this, she talks about how Frances McDormand is there and she's sacrificing her journalistic integrity. And then the two goons, Zeffirelli's two goons, they say, well, if that even exists, I don't think that's a thing anymore. And she says, she talks to Frances McDormand, she says, I don't care that you're sleeping with Zeffirelli. I care that you've fallen in love with him. And Timothy Chalamet says, hold on, she doesn't love me. And afterwards, Frances McDormand says, you know what, you're right. I probably shouldn't be there, but you should probably close that makeup mirror for a second and realize that what's going on around you. And so this whole exchange has gone on long enough to run out the clock, and they're out of time. And then the cops start charging with tear gas and rubber bullets by the command of the government. And as they break through one of the barriers the students created, she tells the girl and Zeffirelli, get out of here, you two kids, and go have sex. And she says, I'm a virgin. And then Zeffirelli says, yeah, me too. Well, except with the journalist, of course. So they head out on her motorcycle, and there's a really cool blue light shot of the two of them. And then you have the intimate scene where they're kissing each other. But after this, you learn that they are broadcasting their manifesto from a radio station, but turns out that there's malfunction. Zeffirelli starts to climb it, but then the radio tower falls over and kills him in the process. Zeffirelli turns into a martyr, and the narrator, Angelica Houston, talks about how his image is commercialized and put on t-shirts and merchandise for every group of angsty student that came after him. But overall, Wes Anderson's done it again, man, and I can't wait. I'm completely broke right now, so I won't be able to go pay for another ticket, but as soon as it's on the Google Play Store, I'm buying it in 4K, because, man, it seems like Wes Anderson is another director that, like, you look at his filmography, has he made a bad movie? I don't think so. Anyway, I'm not going to try to rate this movie out of 10 or anything. I'm just going to say it's great and that you should go see it.